Society Great, and Vietnam Stalemate. I am, as always, your host, Christopher Paul Dugdale, MDMA. We are at Duncanville High School in these United States, and today is April 1st, 2021. And on this date in history, on the 4th, so that'll, in just a few days, it's the anniversary of MLK's assassination. He was shot in Memphis. He was there trying to negotiate better contracts for the sanitation workers of the city, and while standing on his balcony, he was shot. The Great Society. This is LBJ's program. This is what he wanted to do and how he wanted to change the world. There were 435 bills that were passed and 60 programs that were started. This was LBJ's war on poverty. The idea was to wipe out poverty in the United States. So, we're not going to talk about all 60 programs, just 58 of them. Actually, we're not going to talk about 58. Anyway, the first one we're going to talk about here is Medicare. And Medicare is a insurance program for the elderly. Okay? And this is funded in part through Social Security. But for anyone who's ever had a job, they take Medicare out of every one of your checks from the day you start paying taxes. We Medicare about the elderly. Okay, Medicaid. This is health care for those living on welfare or living below the poverty line. Okay, so we give aids to the poor. Okay, a lot of that program has been disbanded or rolled into what was Obamacare, and now we'll see where everything goes from here. Project Head Start was a preschool program for for disadvantaged children. So children that couldn't afford to go to private schools with preschool were allowed to go and be a part of the Project Head Start program. And VISTA, this is a program, Volunteers in Service to America. That's an acronym for, VISTA is an acronym for that. This put young people to work in poor school districts. Now, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, otherwise known as HUD, this is done to try and help stop the deterioration of the inner city. Stop some of the riots inside the city, some of the rundown living conditions. The idea was this was going to fix all of this. And LBJ, Lyndon Baines Johnson, installs Robert Weaver as the first secretary of this cabinet post, who is also the first African American to serve in a cabinet. The Immigration and National Services Act. This still limits the number of immigrants that are allowed to come into the nation each year, but it gets rid of the national origin system. So before, they would try and limit people that were not from Western Europe and white, okay, and the right kind of white person is something they might be one of the ways that they term that, but now there's no longer restriction on that as well. So anyway, the legacy of the Great Society. Okay, I know that I just introduced it, and it is something that does a little bit more than that. It does improve some conditions, but the truth is, there was still a lot of want, but someone needed to do something. Civil rights that were passed during this time period, Medicaid, Medicare, and Head Start, which still was going just a few years ago, are all things that are still being used from the Great Society. The Higher Education Act provides scholarships for a great number of people. And the Highway Safety Act actually makes the road safer and required this newfangled thing called seatbelts. They also put in headrests so that you wouldn't break your neck during certain accidents. Okay, but because of all of the government, action into the personal lives and the personal finances of people, there's many people in the conservative movement who are against this, and you'll see the conservative movement really start to build by the time 1970 rolls around. and by 1980, it controls the government for about the next 10 years after that. The counterculture or hippies. These are people that dropped out of society, and the idea was for them to kind of live together in harmony with nature. A lot of these kids are middle class kids that were doing this, and in the end, they end up taking their same places and position that they would have taken before. But they promote outrageous dress compared to the time period, long hair, rock music, drug use, free and independent living, free love. These are all part of counterculture or hippies. The communes. This is where people would move into a utopian society, and there are some of these across the United States. They grow all their own food. They'd live together and they shared everything, and by everything I mean everything. Haight-Ashbury in San Francisco is kind of a center for the communes, and you would see from time to time members of the Beatles that would show up there. By the way, Haight-Ashbury is where two streets come together in San Francisco. You can see some of the homes that are in that area. So anyway, having fun. Now, while LBJ was working hard on the domestic front, on the foreign fronts, it was not the same thing. Okay, so let's talk about the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. Okay, we had some of our destroyers off the coast of North Vietnam. Okay, you can see the Gulf of Tonkin right there in the picture on the left-hand side. And what happened is, allegedly, some North Vietnamese torpedo boats fired on 2 U.S. destroyers. The 2 U.S. destroyers were not in danger in any way whatsoever from these little torpedo boats. Also, there's some rumors that the shots may have come off the destroyers themselves, or maybe off of the shore. But LBJ used this in Congress to get Congress into a war fervor, and Congress will vote in the Gulf of Tonkin resolution to give the president its war powers. This means that the president not only is in control of the military, but he's in control of financing, he's in control of the entire way that it's waged, and the fact that there is a war. Okay, which is kind of dangerous. If you like someone like you might like LBJ, that's fine. But what happens if you have a president you don't like? And not only that, whenever you look at how the Supreme Court kept FDR in check, then you want to be really careful with how you wage any type of war. One of the biggest struggles in fighting the war in Vietnam was the fact that not only were you fighting the North Vietnamese army, but you were also fighting a group of freedom fighters, the Viet Cong. Okay, and the Viet Cong could be anywhere, they could be everywhere, or they could be nowhere at any point. And they were supplied through what was called the Ho Chi Minh Trail. This is the Viet Cong supply line through Cambodia and Laos. And basically what they would do is just go in and sneak in through those two countries into South Vietnam. And they had such a series of tunnels that if you put all the tunnels end to end, they could stretch all the way from New York to almost to Los Angeles. They were that long. They were about 2,500 miles worth of tunnels. And so that's one of the major things that that they're fighting against. So it can make you paranoid if the enemy can come out of any place, any time, without any type of warning. Now, Operation Rolling Thunder. This is a full-scale bombing of North Vietnam. In this bombing of North Vietnam, we dropped more bombs than we did on Germany and Japan during World War II. Okay, now the thought is, if the U.S. had, put all their military together, couldn't they just simply overrun North Vietnam? The problem was if the U.S. ordered a full scale invasion of North Vietnam, it was probable and most likely that China would have gotten involved in the war. Now, there was a real bloody stalemate going on, and the Viet Cong were hiding everywhere. Okay, and so guerrilla warfare means that you are hiding in plain sight, and most people think that means camouflage in the jungle. But the truth of the matter is that you could hide anywhere. You could hide in a classroom, okay, and all you had to do was look like anyone else. And if you think about it, the Viet Cong were Vietnamese people, and they didn't always wear uniforms. They could just simply dress like anyone else in the community, and then they could just hide amongst them. To combat all of the Viet Cong hiding in the jungle, the U.S. is going to drop bombs filled with napalm, a jelly gasoline that explodes on contact and it will burn until it's completely consumed. You can see over there on the left hand side what a bomb with napalm in it looks like whenever it blows up. Okay? And also, if they're hiding in the leaves and the trees and shrubs, uh, then get rid of the trees and get rid of the shrubs and get rid of all the leaves. And the way that they would do that was by a chemical called Agent Orange. And if you look on the picture on the right, that's a picture of planes spraying Agent Orange all over the area of that they were fighting in Vietnam. And so another major problem that you don't think about whenever you're using all this warfare is if you have a chemical like this that strips off all the leaves off of trees and shrubs, what would that do to people? Because what would happen is you spray this, it gets down into the groundwater, into the drinking water, and sometimes it covers the men themselves, and then they have all types of conditions. And you have a lot of veterans today that are suffering from conditions caused by Agent Orange. My uncle's quadruple bypass, they attributed that to Agent Orange. So on the bright side, the Veterans Hospital or the Veterans Authority, the VA, paid for him to have surgery to save his life. Now, the truth is, this is what was called a living room war. And on the news each night, you had reporters that were filming live from the battlefront. Okay? They would show fighting going on. You would sometimes see executions and assassinations on television while you're watching TV. But at the end of the day, they would also put up stats of how many Viet Cong were killed and how many U.S. troops were killed. And as this went on longer and longer, it became questionable whether or not, we were really doing as well in the war as we claimed to be, and people started to question just how well we were doing in the war. Okay, so this is going to create what's called a credibility gap, and in any war, the longer the war lasts, the less support you have to fight the war. And people didn't believe what the government said anymore about the war. And this had broken a tradition of several centuries where the American people thought that the government had their best interest in common. The Civil Rights Act of 1964. This is a major piece of legislation and really causes a split in the Democratic Party in the South. This stopped segregation in public places. There's lawsuits to end school segregation, which still will be around for about another 10 to 15 years. It also requires employers to end discrimination. For women, there's an important portion of this where Title VII disallows the hiring discrimination of women. So basically for women and for all races. So this is a major time in the civil rights movement. Uh, Also, in 1968, 4 years later, the 24th Amendment will abolish the poll tax. So there's several motions that are taken to try and end segregation and the lack of equal rights in the United States. The free speech movement. This starts at Cal Berkeley. Now, on the left-hand side at the top, you see that is Mario Savio. He's standing on top of a police car speaking to a crowd. Students were trying to pass out brochures and assemble on campus at Cal Berkeley to protest the Vietnam War. They were told that they could not do that on campus. So Mario Savio started a sit-in of 700 protesters, and they stopped classes for 2 days until they were all arrested. The Supreme Court supported the students' right to free speech and assembly on campus. This is true for college campuses and not on high school campuses. Part of that is because you're required to pay to go to a state campus and everyone's over the age of 18. The same type of things don't apply to minors. minors, not the coal miners. So the draft targeted men 18 to 25, but you could delay going into the military if you were going to college. The majority of people that were drafted were at or below the poverty line, and many African Americans will serve in the Vietnam War. This is one of the first times in U.S. history that African Americans will actively serve in combat roles across the line. This is not to say that African Americans did not serve in combat lines before, but the truth was, most of the time, due to racial prejudice, African Americans were not serving on the front lines. 200,000 people ignored their draft notices. 4,000 people ended up going to prison, and about 56,000 people qualified to be a conscientious objector, and so they weren't someone who would go and fight in the war, and they wouldn't be drafted either because they had qualified as a conscientious objector. Several others will flee the country. One of the most famous draft dodgers from Vietnam is William Jefferson Clinton, also known as Bill Clinton. In 1978, Jimmy Carter pardons all the Vietnam draft dodgers, and that makes for several of them to return to public life. Students for Democratic Society. This is one of the OVs that the OV that's due this week. This is led by Tom Hayden, and they wrote the Port Huron Statement. They come up with a term called the New Left, and this is someone who wants political reform, racial equality, and workers' rights. They said that corporations and big government should no longer run the U.S. This should sound somewhat familiar. Eventually, they're going to find that people aren't listening to their calls for nonviolence, and they abandon nonviolent passive resistance for the Black Panthers' message of violence. Period. Freedom Summer. So the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, this is under Marion Barry, they go to the South to register voters. These are teams of white and black workers that are going house to house to try and get people registered. Fannie Lou Hamer on the left was arrested and beaten in jail by police. She was no stranger to violence. When she went in for a simple procedure at the doctor's office, she woke up and had a quote unquote hysterectomy to save her life. Many black women were given hysterectomies, which takes away your ability to have children. Okay. She also will later help form the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. Now, one of the things that Freedom Summer's most famous for is the murder of James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner. They were all killed by the KKK for registering voters. They were arrested and released the same day, and minutes after they were released, through a joint venture with the Mississippi police, the KKK picked up the three men, took them out, and killed them execution style and hid their bodies. The FBI started a manhunt to try and find them and their bodies, and this becomes even more controversial when things like this happened all the time in the black community, and the FBI never got involved. And well, now they're involved because there's some white people involved. So they later found the bodies, and uh, this crazy moment ended. And one more day of notes, we finished. I hope everyone's having a good day. I hope everyone's safe. I'll talk to you soon. Signing out.